Chapter 15 is Aggregate Demand and Supply. This is the model for the demand and supply of everything in the overall economy and mainly deals with the short-run economy. Out of all the chapters that we've done besides the supply and demand chapter, which was chapter 4, this is probably the most important chapter. So I'm going to go through it step by step, slide by slide, because it is a little complex, but it's probably going to be one of the more useful ones because this is how most economists now view the short-run economy and then view what causes a recession, what can be done about a recession, and so forth. So let's get started. Let's go through some of the things we want to go through and explain in this chapter. So what we want to do is we want to look at economic fluctuations in this chapter. So economic fluctuations, meaning that the economy has its ups and has its downs. You know, it's like a wavy ocean. So what are certain characteristics, let's say, of a recession? And then we're going to use this model of aggregate demand and aggregate supply to explain recessions and explain these short-run fluctuations. We're going to look at why the aggregate demand and aggregate supply curves look the way that they do, why they have certain slopes, upward sloping, downward sloping curves. And then we're going to look at how the supply curves, specifically for aggregate supply, is different in the short run versus the long run. And what this is going to do is it's going to bring in different theories. It's going to bring in the long run supply curve, which will be our classical understanding of money and our classical understanding of the economy, which is what we spent a lot of time on already in this course. And then we're going to bring in a short run curve, which is something we haven't covered yet really, which will be more able to explain recessions and so forth. So let's go through this a little bit more. So in general, in the economy in the United States, we see that the GDP grows at about 3% every year, and this is because of the productivity chapter. We see, new technologies, we see more human capital, more physical capital, better access to natural resources. So because you have those productivity factors expanding the ability to create goods and services, the economy typically grows. So in general, the economy expands. However, in the short run, there's ups and downs in the economy. It might grow more than a 3% average return, but it might actually shrink 2 or 3%. And when the economic activity is getting smaller or shrinking, that is going to be a recession. So recession, what do you typically see is that you would see a reduction in the real GDP of the country, which means the production of the country is decreasing. And if the production's decreasing, then people's incomes are falling as well. People earn an income because they're producing. So if there's less production, there's a smaller amount of income in the economy. So incomes fall. And then typically think about what happens in a recession. If business activity is falling, then the unemployment rate will be up. So typically in a recession, you are below your full potential when it comes to production. So, you could produce more, but for whatever reason, you're not fully utilizing all your workers. Unemployment rate's higher than it should be. Incomes are lower than what you should have. And a really severe recession would be a depression. And the last depression that I can think of would be the Great Depression. So not very common. All right. So just some facts about economic fluctuations, and all these shaded in bars here are all recessions, and what you see here's our last recession in 08 to 09, and mainly that they are unpredictable. And the main thing with this is if they were predictable, if recessions were predictable, we could do something about it and prevent it from happening. And think about it. If you say, oh, I can predict when the next recession is going to be, typically then you would be able to make all the perfect stock moves because typically stocks drop in a recession and you could be very, very wealthy. So since most people seem to be unable to do that, we're going to assume that recessions are unpredictable. So we know that in general the economy grows. That's why this is an upward trend for production, but these little hiccups, these little downturns are the recessions. And what we're seeing here is that we have a movement of GDP and economic variables together. So GDP and investment moving together. So what we're saying here is that you're in a recession, you can see that investment falls, but also consumption would move with that. Consumption would fall, and your GDP has to fall with that. So the components have to fall. So if you have your overall GDP falling during recession, then investment has to fall in your economy. Consumption has to fall. We don't know what net export's going to do because that's really dependent on what foreigners are doing. And government spending isn't dependent really necessarily on the macroeconomic conditions, but typically private investment and consumption would fall during a recession. And this is really intuitive. As output falls, unemployment rate rises. If businesses have fewer orders or not producing as much stuff, they don't need as many workers. So you can see that every time there's a recession, there's an uptick in unemployment. And this is another reason why recessions are seen as inefficient, because unemployment's above its natural rate, and you're not fully utilizing all your labor resource, and you're not fully producing your full income potential for your full GDP potential for your country.